good or bad, generous or selfish, right or wrong. The easiest thing is to label people categorically. But, as chemist Fritz Haber showcases, things are not always black and white, and reality is cruelly messy. Known for his humanitarian and sinister sides, Fritz Haber will be remembered as a man of paradox. On the one hand, he is credited for saving the lives of billions from starvation. On the other side, he was guilty of inventing chemical weapons that would bring piles of dead bodies. First, a little background. Fritz Haber was a German chemist, born in 1868 into a well-respected Jewish family in Breslau, Prussia. With Robert Bunsen and Karl Lieberman as his mentors in 1886, he started his studies in the field of chemistry. In 1891, he got his doctorate from Friedrich Wilhelm University. In 1894, he took a position as a professor at Karlsruhe University. Between 1894 to 1911, he teamed with scientist Carl Bosch to create the Haber-Bosch process. Chemistry bestowed him a Nobel Prize in 1918. And for good cause. You owe your life as you know it to him. For the most part, people do. They said that he pulled bread out of the air. They were not far off. Before Fritz Haber's breakthrough, experts thought that the human population would eventually reach its peak of 1.5 billion and then begin to suffer starvation. Haber changed the trajectory of the future by finding a solution to one of the toughest problems that mankind has ever encountered: how to feed the planet. For a Breslauer Jew, that was a massive feat. For the most part, he was trying to solve a problem that Germany was having in the late 1800s. The nation had enough sunshine and land to feed 30 million people, but without a means to nourish the crops, another 20 million people would go hungry. The problem's answer was frustratingly simple. The amount of crops one can grow is directly tied to how much nitrogen the soil gets. Getting hands on the element was no difficulty at all. It was practically staring everyone in the face, not just here on Earth, but also everywhere else in the cosmos. 4,000 trillion tons of nitrogen gas, making up nearly 80% of our atmosphere. Beyond our atmosphere, it's the 5th most common element in the universe. But one problem: there was no way to pull it out of the air. Because of its strong trivalent interactions, collecting nitrogen proved to be difficult. Atoms of the element were tightly bound to one another. It seemed implausible to build an energy source strong enough to separate them. But during the early 20th century, Fritz Haber discovered a way to break nitrogen's molecular chains. After forcing air into a huge iron tank under high heat and pressure, he added hydrogen to the tank. This split the nitrogen atoms as they joined with 3 hydrogen atoms to produce ammonia. And on the other side, liquid fertilizer was dripping from the tank. It was done. The nitrogen had been pulled from the air and could be put into the ground to grow food. He publicized his discoveries to the public in 1909. That led him to win the Nobel Prize. If this were the end of the narrative of the German scientist, people would have thought of him as a hero. But his life wasn't meant to be so straightforward. It took a tragic turn, a complete 180-degree turn, from the chemist who fed the world to the father of chemical warfare, not for so good reasons. By the spring of 1915, the Great War had already scattered the shredded, rotting flesh of men and boys across the once lush Belgian fields of Ypres. Bloated bodies bobbed in the oily seas of shell holes. Bullets whizzed through the air in frenzied swarms, hunting down men. On the German side of this horror show stood Fritz Haber. He gazed across the battlefield through pince-nez glasses at his country's enemies, the British, the French, and their Dominion forces. Wrapped in a fur coat against the chill of the late April evening, the German Jewish chemist prepared the signal. 6,000 metal tanks carrying his invention loomed in front of him. The wind was exactly ideal at 6 o'clock in the evening for him to put his plan into action. A Virginian cigar dangled from his neatly shaved mustache. He gave the all clear. God punish England. The bombing stopped. The nozzles were flipped open. 168 tons of chlorine gas was dumped into the battlefield. The 15-foot-high wave of greenish-yellow mist surged over the crumbled terrain of decaying limbs, ripped flesh, and crippled men's screams. When it touched the leaves on the branches, they withered. Grass became metal-colored. Birds fell from the sky. The Allied forces were leery as the gas approached. They thought the Germans would charge once the bombing stopped. With the lowering sun, the gas, pushed by the breeze, took on a pinkish tinge. A guy moving at a fast pace could outwalk it. But no one bolted. Nobody had ever seen anything like that. Slowly, the gas seeped into their trenches and their lungs. It seemed as if toxic needles had been pushed into the olive oil and blood arteries, burning them to a crisp. The horrific pain pushed soldiers to their knees. They screamed in agony, pulling at their throats. Their lungs were clogged with pus and phlegm. Before they coughed up blood, their lips foamed with yellow mucus. They were suffocating on the ground, their faces contorted in pain. Fearful of this new terror, many Allied troops retreated, leaving a 6-kilometer gash in the line. Once the Allies retook their post, they counted almost 5,000 dead soldiers. They had their tunics and shirt fronts ripped apart in a desperate attempt to get some air. This was Fritz Haber's ace idea all along. He volunteered to do it. He drafted a letter to the senior leadership of the German army urging it. He challenged the generals who said it breached the Hague Conventions on Warfare. Repulsive to say the least. Inhumane. Ghastly. Fritz Haber got his way. On April 22nd, he made things much worse. And he couldn't be happier. Yet, 3 years later, he was awarded the 1918 Nobel Prize for tackling the fertilizer problem to relieve world hunger. So, who was Fritz Haber? A genius who ended world hunger? Or was he an evil scientist who created devastating weapons? Fritz's method is still used to date to produce 100 million tons of synthetic fertilizer per year for nearly all of the 7 billion people on Earth, including you. Half of the nitrogen in your body comes from the Haber method. It might just be the greatest scientific discovery ever. It put an end to hostilities, fed children, and ushered in the modern era. This was Fritz Haber's dream. As a soldier and a scientist, he'd done it all. As a German citizen, he had done honor to his homeland. For a Jewish kid from a little town, it was quite the leap. By the time the next global war erupted, Haber had long been dead. But few of his inventions continued to be used, one of which was a pesticide containing hydrogen cyanide known as Zyklon. When the Nazis rediscovered this invention, they knew it was ideal for their interests. A little adjustment to the formula was all that was needed. They ordered their chemists to get rid of the foul smell that served as a warning to the user not to take it in. This was done so that Haber's nieces, grandnephews, friends, and the millions of other Jewish people who were being gassed at Auschwitz would not go into a panic when the Zyklon B was being pumped into the gas chambers. To this day, Historians are at a loss when it comes to evaluating Fritz Haber. Without him, billions of people would not have been able to live their lives. Also without him, World War I would have finished years sooner. Millions would have been spared a gruesome death, and millions more a shattered life. Later, his buddy Albert Einstein would say, Haber's life was the tragedy of the German Jew, the tragedy of unrequited love. There is more to his existence than just blind patriotism. Haber was more than just a German Jew. He was a human being. All monsters are, as are all saints. He was both brilliant and damaging, kind and cruel. He fed billions with his research and relished in the agony of thousands of deaths. He lived in grandeur and died shattered and alone, remorseful of the horrors he had contributed to creating. There's no simple way to balance his sins and virtues on the scales of history. Perhaps there's no use in trying. In the end, he was a guy called Fritz Haber. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times, he is close to being a devil, at times to sainthood. But his name doesn't change, and to that name, we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. For most people, the name Auschwitz is a sinister one-word reminder of the horrors of the Holocaust. For some, it is also a place of pilgrimage, where they can see the remains of the gas chambers and other extermination facilities. Few know about the man who was responsible for overseeing Auschwitz and its death camps. He was known as the Nazi Angel of Death, also known as the SS Doctor Josef Mengele. He was one of the most heinous and evil individuals to have ever lived. He was a doctor who was responsible for killing millions of people during the Holocaust. He was a sadistic and psychopathic individual who loved inflicting pain on others. One of the most notorious Nazi physicians during World War II, who was responsible for carrying out horrifying medical experiments on a large number of inmates at the Auschwitz concentration camp. His unshakable faith in the pseudo-scientific Nazi racial ideology provided the foundation for his justification of innumerable, cruel experiments and operations that he conducted on Jewish and Romani people. Between the years 1943 and 1945, Dr. Josef Mengele became known throughout Auschwitz as the Angel of Death. Mengele, along with other Nazi physicians working at the camp, was given the task of determining which inmates would be executed immediately and which would be kept alive for the purpose of doing laborious tasks or being used in experiments on humans. Many prisoners remembered him as being particularly cruel. When seeking to make sense of Josef Mengele's heinous deeds, there is no horrific past to point the finger at and blame for his actions. Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the city of Günzburg, Germany. He was a well-liked and wealthy youngster whose father managed a successful company during a period when the economy of Germany as a whole was in free fall. It seemed that everyone at school liked Mengele, and he always scored excellent grades. After finishing high school, it was only reasonable to assume that he would continue his education at a university and that he would be successful in anything he set his mind to do. Mengele earned his first doctorate in anthropology from the University of Munich in 1935. Later on, he completed his postdoctoral study under Nazi eugenicist Dr. Ottmar Freer von Verschuer. Von Verschuer was one of the Nazi-aligned scientists whose work aimed to justify the idea that a person is the result of their ancestry. This idea was important to the ideology of National Socialism, which maintained that people are the product of their ancestry. The research conducted by von Verschuer focused on the role that genetics play in the development of congenital abnormalities such as cleft palates. When Mengele left the laboratory in 1938, he took with him a ringing endorsement from von Verschuer, and that's where the transition started. Mengele had been an eager companion of von Verschuer. He chose the issue of ethnic differences in lower jaw development as the focus of his dissertation. In the years to come, Josef Mengele would be doing considerably more than merely writing about themes like eugenics and Nazi racial philosophy. He joined the Nazi Party at age 26 while working in Frankfurt. In 1938, he signed up to be a member of the Schutzstaffel as well as a Wehrmacht reserve unit. Upon his mobilization in 1940, he seemed to be eager to serve, even signing up for the Waffen-SS Medical Corps as a volunteer. Between the fall of France and the invasion of the Soviet Union, Mengele practiced eugenics in Poland by evaluating Polish nationals for potential Germanization or race-based citizenship in the Third Reich. In the year 1941, his regiment saw active duty in a fighting role in Ukraine. On the Eastern Front, Josef Mengele made a name for himself quite fast. He was awarded many medals, including one for rescuing injured soldiers from a blazing tank, and was often praised for his devotion to duty. However, in January of 1943, a German army capitulated in the Stalingrad battleground. And during the summer of that same year, again, another German army was decimated at Kursk. During the meat grinder attack that took place between the two engagements at Rostov, Mengele suffered serious wounds that left him unable to continue participation in a combat role. So he had to go back, and once in Germany, he reunited with his old mentor von Verschuer and was promoted to captain before being assigned the task that would make him infamous: a mission to sterilize the world's population. A few months later, in May of 1943, Mengele reported to work at Auschwitz. He arrived at Auschwitz at a time of change. This was the first time the camp had stepped up its killing machine, centered on the Birkenau subcamp, where Mengele was stationed as a medical officer and where he was responsible for the mass executions. It was only a matter of time until Auschwitz would be a frenzy of activities, and Mengele would be at the center of it all. Survivors and guards remember him as an eager staff member who volunteered for extra duties, handled operations beyond his pay grade, and appeared to be everywhere at the camp at once. There's no question that Mengele was in his element at Auschwitz. His outfit was usually immaculate and ironed, and he seemed to have a little grin on his face at all times. Many of the camp's doctors considered the task to be depressing, as it required them to divide incoming shipments of prisoners into two groups: those who would be forced to labor and those who would be instantly gassed. In contrast, Josef Mengele was a fan of this work, and he was prepared to accept other physicians' arrival ramp hours whenever they were available. Mengele was also in charge of an infirmary where sick prisoners were put to death. He would assist other German physicians with their work, oversaw inmate medical personnel, and performed his own study among the thousands of detainees whom he had personally chosen for the human experiment program that he had initiated and administered. The experiments that Josef Mengele conceived of were so wicked that they defy belief. He was motivated and invigorated by the apparently endless supply of condemned human beings who were put at his disposal. As a result, he resumed the work he had begun in Frankfurt, which included researching the effect of genetics on a variety of physical characteristics. In other words, he conducted his human experiments on hundreds of inmates, many of whom were still minors at the time. Many of these inmates were used as fodder in his experiments. For his genetic studies, he preferred identical twins since, because they had identical DNA. Because of this, any disparities that existed between them must have been due to the influences of their environments. In Mengele's mind, this made pairs of twins the ideal test subjects for identifying genetic elements through comparison and contrast of their bodies and behaviors. In the course of his work, Mengele gathered hundreds of pairs of twins and spent hours measuring and taking detailed notes on each of them. He often administered unknown drugs to one of the twins by injection, and then he observed the resulting disease. As part of his experiments, he used severe clamps to generate gangrene in children's limbs, gave them spinal taps, and injected dye into their eyes. When one of the test subjects passed away, the other child's twin was instantly put to death by receiving an injection of chloroform to the heart. Both of the bodies were then dissected for comparison. Josef Mengele was responsible for the deaths of 14 sets of twins using this method during one of his experiments. He spent the night doing an autopsy on his victims. For all of his methodical work habits, Mengele had a volatile temperament. During one selection between work and death on the arrival platform, a middle-aged woman who had been selected for work refused to be separated from her 14-year-old daughter who had been assigned death. When one of the guards attempted to pull them apart, he got a nasty scrape on his face. Mengele stepped in to resolve the matter by shooting both the girl and her mother right on the spot. After murdering them, he then cut short the selection process and sent everybody to the gas chamber. Transports of new captives to Auschwitz slowed down throughout the fall and winter of 1944 and 1945 and finally came to a complete halt. This was as a direct result of the mass extermination of Hungarian inmates that occurred during the summer of 1944. By January 1945, the majority of the camp infrastructure at Auschwitz had been taken down and removed. Josef Mengele fled to the west in order to escape being apprehended by the Soviet authorities. He took his study papers and specimens with him, but he left them with a colleague. Mengele managed to avoid the victorious Allies until June, when he was picked up by an American patrol. He was traveling under his own name at the time, but the wanted criminal list hadn't been efficiently distributed, and so the Americans let him go. Before fleeing Germany in 1949, Mengele worked as a farmhand in Bavaria. He was able to evade arrest for decades by using many identities and, in some cases, even his own identity. He had the benefit of almost no one hunting for him, and the governments of Brazil and Argentina, as well as Paraguay, were all sympathetic to Nazis fleeing to these countries for safety. Mengele couldn't stay quiet, not even in exile, despite the fact that he stood to lose all if he were discovered. In the 1950s, he opened an illegal medical practice in Buenos Aires and specialized in carrying out illegal abortions. This actually got him arrested when one of his patients died, but according to one witness, a friend of his showed up in court with a bulging envelope full of cash for the judge, who subsequently dismissed the case. And on February 7, 1979 in Sao Paulo in Brazil, Josef Mengele, who was 67 at the time, took a dip in the Atlantic Ocean. He had a sudden stroke when he was in the water, and it ultimately led to his death. After Mengele's death, his friends and family members gradually admitted that they had known all along where he had been hiding and that they had sheltered him from facing justice. Although he was brought to justice, his legacy of evil will forever be remembered.